Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Maxwell School's The USA at 250 course. My name is Tessa Murphy. I am Maxwell Dean's Associate Professor of Atlantic History here at the Maxwell School, where I offer courses on early American history broadly defined. So that would include anything from an overview of US history to 1865 to upper level courses focusing on things like the Age of Revolutions and comparative perspective. And my own research focuses primarily, as you may be able to tell from this lecture, on the colonial Caribbean. Today, I'll be talking to you about what happens during the American Revolution beyond the 13 colonies, and I'll be thinking specifically about American independence and the British Empire. In all of my classes, I like to lead with three key questions that people should be able to come away from the lecture in a position to answer. And so for today, these questions are: what was British North America like on the age of revolution, on the eve of the revolution? So around 1775, what were the geographic boundaries of Great Britain's claims to North America? But also, who was living there? Where were they living? What was the demographic composition of British North America? You'll also learn about how different groups of British subjects in the Americas responded to the outbreak of revolution, or really to the outbreak of conflict between the Crown and some of its colonies. And I cheated a little bit here. I broke this into two parts. So we'll think first about the people who remain loyal to Great Britain, people who come to be known as loyalists, and we'll be thinking about white loyalists as well as Indigenous and Black loyalists. And then we'll also be thinking primarily about white subjects elsewhere in the British Americas, and here focusing, given my research, on the British Caribbean. And finally, certainly this is a huge question. It's somewhat outside the scope of the US at 250, but we will be thinking about how the British Empire evolved after the loss of those 13 colonies that become the United States. So what lessons did the British Empire learn from losing 13 of its American colonies? And I'll finish off with some reading recommendations for anyone who would like to know more. So to begin, to situate us here, this map probably looks familiar to many of you. These are the 13 colonies that become the United States, those that break away from Great Britain in 1776. And what you can see here, of course, is that they really hug the coast. They're relatively small given the much larger size of even mainland North America. But this gives us a much clearer sense of British North America around 1775. So this map isn't perfect, but it certainly looks very different to this. Few things that I want to highlight here. Of course, British claims to the Americas stretch much farther north, right? This giant territory here, as of 1775, is Quebec, which has not yet been divided into Upper and Lower Canada, what become Ontario and Quebec. Instead, it's this vast territory that Great Britain has just acquired from the French in 1763, the end of the 7 Years' War, as we'll talk about. British claims also extend all the way up into the Arctic with Prince Rupert's Land, which is actually administered by the Hudson's Bay Company. They stretch out into the Atlantic with Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, which at the time is called St. John's Island. And they also, very importantly, although it's harder to see, stretch into the Atlantic, right? This is Bermuda over here, and also well into the Caribbean. So this is the Bahamian archipelago here, Jamaica, all the way down here is Barbados, and a little chain of islands here in the Eastern Caribbean that includes places like Grenada, St. Vincent, and Dominica. So this matters because when Great Britain and the Crown and Parliament are thinking about the decisions that they want to make for the colonies, they're not just thinking about the 13 colonies that end up becoming the United States. They're thinking about administering a vast and quite diverse empire. Understanding that helps us get a better sense of the British Empire as a whole, but it also helps to break up some of the assumptions that we might bring to our understanding of American independence, right? It's not all British colonial subjects who choose to engage in open rebellion against the Crown. And the alliances that end up forming between, let's say, a colonial subject in South Carolina and one in New York are not necessarily a given, right? So this is not a clear division between mainland and island or north and south. It's important to think about the internal and external factors that lead some British colonial subjects to rebel and many, many others to remain loyal. The British Empire itself within North America had evolved a lot relatively recently. And so this map shows the shape of European claims to the Americas in before 1763, so just prior to the 7 Years' War, or what people in North America often refer to as the French and Indian War. And what you can see here is, again, the British claims are hugging the coast. There's massive French claims to the North American interior here, stretching far beyond Quebec and into what was known as the Louisiana Territory, but is, of course, much bigger than present-day Louisiana. And then we've got Spanish claims in Florida, the Caribbean, and also further west in mainland North America. This changes really dramatically as a result of the 1763 Treaty of Paris. What you can see here is France is essentially wiped from the map of North America. And in his book, Max Adelson talks about how Britain is imagining this newly expanded empire, as well as how the people who are living in this expanded empire push back. Britain finds itself, after 1763, ruling over a vast territory, as you can see, that really has a diversity of colonial subjects. So people living in these former French territory are overwhelmingly French-speaking. They practice the Catholic religion. So for a Protestant, English-speaking crown, they have to figure out how they're going to rule over these new colonial subjects. The consequences of the 7 Years' War have been explored by many historians. They include increasing kind of top-down imperial governance, so increased attempts at control, the drawing of this proclamation line that you can see here, by which Great Britain tried to police who could settle on the other side of that line. They include increased taxes in order to pay back the debts incurred as a result of fighting the 7 Years' War, as well as the increased military presence throughout British North America. And so these actions by the Crown lead a lot of colonial subjects, both in the 13 colonies and also, as we'll see, in the Caribbean, to become fed up with the Crown, to start engaging in acts of rebellion. But I think it's also important to remember that the actions of people here are not necessarily the same as those of everybody in British North America. And so, having understood kind of the shape of British North America on the eve of revolution, I want to turn to question 2, this diversity of responses to the outbreak of conflict within the British Empire. I think a great way to approach this question is through a primary source, so through a drawing that was made in 1783 by Benjamin West. And this is depicting, as the title suggests, the reception of the American loyalists by Great Britain. There's a few things that I want to highlight about this image. So West was a Pennsylvania-born artist. He traveled to England in 1763 and he never left. So we can put him among the loyalists there. And in his drawing here, he's showing us the diversity of people who remain loyal to the British Empire in the face of rebellion on the part of some colonial subjects in the 13 colonies. The actual painting has been lost, right? So this is an etching made of the painting, I believe. But West put a little kind of Easter egg here. So this is his painting of John Wilmot, an English judge who oversaw the Loyalist Claims Commission. That's actually what the paper here says. And in this background of his portrait of John Wilmot, he's included the painting that he made of the reception of American loyalists by Great Britain. And what you can see if you toggle between the etching and then the colored in painting is you really get an appreciation of the diversity of people who remained loyal to Great Britain during this conflict. So we can see here, certainly the colonial elite, right? Based on their dress, the wigs that they're wearing, their age, these older white men are part of the social and political elite of the colonists, and they might be motivated to remain loyal because of the benefits that they derive as loyal subjects of the British Crown, the Crown being represented here both by the Crown itself and then also by Britannia extending her helping hand and her shield to protect these loyalists. This is actually Wilmot here. You can see him represented in this image. But very importantly, you also see women and children in this image. You see loyalists who are indigenous to North America, and you also see here in the background a number of African-American loyalists. And so West is very deliberate in his depiction here. He's showing the range of people who chose to remain loyal to Great Britain, often at enormous personal, social, economic expense as their neighbors took up arms against Great Britain. So who were these loyalists? As West's image suggests, they're diverse people with diverse motives. They could be rich, they could be poor, men, women, white, black, indigenous, but they were numerous. So we know that more than 20% of white settlers in the 13 colonies remained openly loyal to Great Britain, right? So they would continue to make professions of loyalty even when called before committees to account for their actions, for example, right? So at great potential personal cost, they remain openly loyal. About 1/3 of people, historians estimate, remained on the fence. So they wouldn't openly say whether they were a patriot or a loyalist. They were more happy to kind of wait and see how everything played out. So that's a huge segment of Great Britain's North American population there. And their reasons for remaining loyal varied just as much as their identities did. As you saw when we were looking at that image, if you were among the colonial elite, perhaps you had really important economic ties to Great Britain and you didn't want to lose that trade relationship. Perhaps you had been installed at the top of the colonial hierarchy and you were worried about losing that influence. You wanted to preserve those hierarchies. We see a lot of loyalists among the slaveholding population because they, rather than opposing the posting of troops, for example, to the colonies, they want the protection from what they perceive as like an internal threat of the people that they enslave. You also see, and this is shown in part in Ruma Chopra's primary source collection here, Choosing Sides, that there are a number of British colonial subjects who are really alienated by the actions of patriots. When we in the United States get the story of the American Revolution, the patriots are the heroes. But the patriots also engage in acts of war against their political opponents. And as you can see in this contemporaneous image, this is a group of patriots who are forcing tea down the throat of a loyalist. You also see patriots doing things like burning stamp collectors in effigy, right? So burning representations of stamp collectors, not stamp collectors themselves, but also tarring and feathering people who are carrying out the directives of the crown. So certainly there are loyalists who are alienated by what the patriots are doing. And you also have a lot of people who, when they look at the lay of the land and they look at the army and navy and alliances of the British Empire, which has just recently soundly defeated France in a global war, right, the 7 Years' War, they have every reason to look at Great Britain, to look at the patriots who are just then forming an army, forming a kind of ragtag navy by licensing privateers, and coming to the conclusion that these patriots have no chance and they want to ally with the side that they believe will win. For all of these reasons, we have hundreds of thousands of people remaining loyal and up to 100,000 loyalists, as Maya Jasanoff describes in her book, Liberty's Exiles. Up to 100,000 loyalists, white, black, and indigenous, choosing to leave the new United States in order to remain under British rule. And that, I think, is very important because it shows the depth of allegiance that some British colonial subjects maintained even in the wake of US independence. And I think that's an important dimension for us to keep in mind. So that brings us to who some of these loyalists were. And we'll begin here with this question of Indigenous loyalists, which has particular relevance here in central New York, as Syracuse University sits on Onondaga land. And of course, there's no single or unified Indigenous response. This is actually the moment at which the Haudenosaunee, a confederacy that had existed by this time, for several hundred years, split for the first time. Many members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy chose to side with the people who they thought would win, the British. The Oneida and Tuscarora make the opposite decision. They side with the Patriots, and so we see this splitting among the Haudenosaunee Confederacy for the first time. In response to the Haudenosaunee decision to side with the British, we see the Patriots under George Washington carry the war into the heart of Haudenosaunee territory and adopt a scorched earth policy. Among the Haudenosaunee, Washington is seen as, quote, the destroyer of towns. This turns central upstate and central New York into a contested battleground. In a 1779 letter, George Washington instructs Major General John Sullivan in his Sullivan campaign to, quote, "The expedition you are appointed to command is to be directed against the hostile tribes of the Six Nations of Indians with their associates and adherents. The immediate objects of this campaign are the total destruction and devastation of their settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent their planting more. You will not, by any means, listen to any overture of peace before the total ruin of their settlements is effected." End quote. Given the nature of the Patriot campaign in central New York, the deliberate attempts to ruin Haudenosaunee villages and the crops planted, we see in the wake of American independence a resettlement of Indigenous loyalists in the parts of British North America that Great Britain had managed to retain. And so many Haudenosaunee follow one of their leaders, Joseph Brant, to what becomes Upper Canada, later Ontario, so the Brantford region named for Joseph Brant, where the Six Nations of the Grand River Reservation remains to this day. So a very important consequence of loyalism in the United States and in wider British North America. We also have many Black loyalists. So in 1775, the British governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issues a proclamation. He declares martial law. He enjoins all British subjects in the colony of Virginia to take up arms for the British or, quote, be looked upon as traitors to His Majesty's crown and government. And very importantly, he, quote, further declared all indentured servants, enslaved people, or others appertaining to rebels free that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity. So the translation here is that if you are an enslaved person and the person who claims ownership over you is a patriot and is therefore is a traitor to His Majesty's government, and you come behind British lines, you will be free. You can join the British forces and earn your freedom through military service. And what happens in the wake of Dunmore's proclamation is that as many as 2,000 enslaved people immediately flock to behind British lines at Norfolk. From these individuals, Dunmore creates something known as the Ethiopian Regiment. Unfortunately, the conditions at Norfolk were terrible in this period, and many of those who sought freedom behind British lines died of smallpox and typhoid. But there are very important consequences of Dunmore's proclamation and others that were modeled on it. the Patriots respond to Dunmore's proclamation by ordering the execution of any enslaved people that they find deserting behind British lines. The British realize this is a very good way to undermine Patriot forces and also Patriot economic activity. And so there are subsequent British declarations that are modeled on Dunmore's. Most importantly, in 1779, General Clinton issued something called the Phillipsburg Declaration, and that freed enslaved people who absconded to the British, even if they didn't fight on the British side. And as a result, we have as many as 20,000 enslaved people out of a total enslaved population of about 500,000 at the time of the Revolution, who liberated themselves behind British lines during the Revolution. Of those, more than 3,000 ultimately relocated to Nova Scotia. So again, we see another British territory in North America being really shaped by this loyalist exodus that emerges after U.S. independence. Upper Canada shaped by primarily white and Indigenous loyalists, Nova Scotia shaped by white and Black loyalists. And others travel all the way to a British colony in West Africa, Sierra Leone. And these are traced in a novelization based on a primary source that also became a miniseries called The Book of Negroes. So a couple of reading possibilities there if you're interested in learning more about Black loyalists. So this brings us to the second part of this question of loyalists, which is how did subjects elsewhere, British subjects elsewhere in the British Empire, respond to the outbreak of conflict between the Crown and some of its colonial subjects. And here I'd like to turn to my area of research, the Caribbean. The Caribbean is very often left out of discussions of American independence and the American Revolution. There's one excellent book that you can see here by Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy that thinks about the American Revolution and the British Caribbean. What were the similarities and differences between mainland and island colonies? How did British colonial subjects in the Caribbean respond to the outbreak of conflict between Great Britain and the mainland colonies? And what's important here is that some British subjects did share the grievances of mainland colonial subjects against the Crown. They were very upset, for example, about the Stamp Act and about the imposition of colonial tariffs. But as O'Shaughnessy argues, there are very important differences between the Caribbean and most of the colonies that end up in open rebellion against the Crown. The first is that enslaved people vastly outnumber free people throughout the Caribbean. So in 1775, close to 80% of the population of Barbados is enslaved. More than 90% of the population of Jamaica is enslaved. In what becomes the United States, the enslaved population of South Carolina reaches about 50%. So that's the largest almost enslaved majority. But that's not until the mid-19th century. So on the eve of revolution, you do not have any mainland colonies where enslaved people are a majority of the population. And so planters, right, the colonial elite, do not feel as threatened by the people that they are holding in bondage in the mainland as they do in the islands. These planters in the Caribbean, a lot of them don't actually live in the Caribbean. So their ties to Great Britain are a lot stronger because they actually live, many of them, in Greater London. They participate in government by representing their interest through colonial lobbies, right? The West Indian lobby being a key one. And so they maintain much closer ties to Great Britain. And as a result, they're very reliant on Great Britain for trade relationships, for protection against both external attack, right, if someone were to come to these islands, but also protection against what they see as an internal enemy, right, the people that they are holding in slavery potentially rising up against them. And they also have much stronger, in many cases, cultural ties to Great Britain that prevent them from severing those ties in the ways that people in the mainland did. What happens in the Caribbean varies a little bit. Although most colonial subjects in the Caribbean remained loyal to Great Britain, what happens in that part of British North America is still very important, both to the course of the revolution itself and, getting towards our third question, to the shape of the British Empire after independence. One of the things that's important to keep in mind is that the American Revolution also becomes an intercolonial conflict. In February rather, in 1778, France signed a treaty of amity and commerce with the Americans. What that means is, second only to Morocco, France has recognized what becomes the United States as a sovereign nation. And so they, in allying themselves with the Patriots, have declared war on Great Britain. And so this intra-imperial contest, this rebellion by some colonial subjects in North America against the crown, becomes, as of February 1778, an inter-imperial war. In my book, which you see here, I talk about what motivated people in the Caribbean to accept or even welcome French conquest, and what that says about the multi-ethnic, multilingual nature of the British Empire at this time. Spain follows suit, allying itself with the Patriots and declaring war on Great Britain in June of 1779. And what this means is Great Britain is no longer just trying to bring colonial subjects in the North American mainland to heel. They're also engaged in warfare on land and particularly on the seas with France and with Spain. And here again, I want you to keep the context of the 7 Years' War in mind. That war just ended in 1763. It ended with Great Britain acquiring many former French and a few Spanish territories. And so this provides a great opportunity for France and Spain to retake territories that they have only recently lost. The British forces now are spread very thin. They cannot focus only on the North American main. They need to be on the defensive against Spanish and especially French attacks in the Caribbean and also on the coast of Florida. And so here you can see what happens. The French conquer the island of Dominica in September of 1778, St. Vincent in June of 1779. Grenada surrenders actually on July 4th, 1779. And Tobago, which is the only island that puts up a little bit of a fight to French conquest, surrenders in 1781. And so this map, I think, provides a really key reminder that for Great Britain and its rivals, what we think of as the American Revolution or the War for Independence was about more than just the 13 colonies. It's also about the shape of their respective empires and what each empire will be able to retain or perhaps gain as a result of this renewed inter-imperial war. And this brings us to the third question, the shape of the Americas and the British Empire more broadly after US independence. 20 years after that 1763 Treaty of Paris, there's another Treaty of Paris, and this again redraws the map of North America. As you can see here, British claims to the mainland are drastically reduced. The United States is recognized as a sovereign nation with a considerable territory here. You have Britain also forced to return British Florida back to the Spanish for a brief period. And you have the French forced to return those islands that they had conquered in 1778 and 1779 in the Caribbean. They do keep Tobago until it is conquered again during the Napoleonic Wars in 1793. In the Americas, Britain has new priorities given the presence of this emerging nation here, the United States. They focus on securing Canada, primarily by settling it with people who will remain loyal to the crown. What this means is, and leads to, is an influx of primarily white and Indigenous settlers into what in 1791 becomes Upper Canada and later becomes the province of Ontario. And their focus in the Caribbean is to maximize plantation production and ensure that their remaining colonies are economically strong enough to continue to support the empire. British attitudes towards imperial governance more broadly do change a little bit in this period. P.J. Marshall, whose book you can see here, has disputed that there's any kind of clean break between what historians used to conceive of as the first and second British Empire, the first focusing on the Americas and coming to a definitive end with the loss of the 13 colonies, and the second British Empire emerging because of this turn to the east that historians used to believe happened after 1783. Certainly, after 1783, Great Britain increases its presence in India. It establishes what will ultimately become a white settlement colony in Australia in 1788, right? Roughly coinciding with the loss of the 13 colonies. One of the bigger takeaways of what Great Britain learned from losing the 13 colonies is a different kind of colonial rule. The experience of having colonial assemblies protest British administration in the colonies leads the British to adopt crown colony governance in many of its new territories, particularly those with a majority non-white population. In a crown colony, the British appoint governors who rule on the advice of an appointed council, and there is no locally elected assembly exercising power, as you saw in Virginia, for example. So a big takeaway here is that the American Revolution made British administrators wary of elected colonial assemblies whose interests might increasingly deviate from those of the crown. There's a lot to take away from this examination of American independence from the perspective of the wider British Empire. As you can see from this map, which shows the British Empire at its territorial height in the early 20th century, the loss of the 13 colonies did not mean the end of the British Empire. Instead, what we can see here is that Great Britain retained its hold over a vast swath of territory in North America and extended its rule into South America, Africa, India, and Australia and the Indian Ocean. The loss of the 13 colonies, then, did not prevent the British Empire from expanding in size or power. Instead, the lessons learned from this civil and inter-imperial war shaped imperial governance for more than a century. So what can we take away from our examination of the British Empire and its wider relationship to the American Revolution? First, I think it's important not to assume that British North America is coterminous with or composed entirely of the 13 colonies. When we assume that British North America and what become the United States are the same, we ignore or erase the very wide, dispersed, and diverse groups of people who were British colonial subjects. Second, when we assume that everyone in the 13 colonies was a patriot, rather than exploring the many motivations that different groups of people had for remaining loyal to the crown, we miss the extent of division within the British colonial population. And we risk then assuming that independence was a foregone conclusion rather than something that was highly contingent. So we need to pay attention not only to the patriots, but to those who were willing to oppose them, often at great personal risk, and understand what motivated them to make that often very unpopular decision. By instead uncovering colonial subjects' diverse motivations, as well as where and why they went elsewhere in the British Empire after US independence, we gain insight on the plural nature of the colonial Americas, as well as how the British Empire evolved after the emergence of the United States. In looking at that evolution, we can also see some of the lessons that British officials learned from the loss of 13 of their 26 American colonies, and appreciate how the birth of the United States also reshaped the empire from which it came. And for those who are interested, this is a list of some of the books that I mentioned over the course of this lecture. Thank you very much.